Good evening. I am Clara Nightwell. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There are structures built with the intention of permanence that collapse so completely, they become difficult to remember as real. And when they collapse, the world before them can seem almost impossible to those who never lived through it. Tonight, we turn to a physical barrier that divided not just a city, but an entire nation, and whose fall marked the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. We ask what it means for a country to be cut in half for nearly 3 decades, and what it means when that division ends not through war, but through the exhaustion of the system that imposed it.
The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years, from 1961 to 1989. But the division it represented began much earlier, in the rubble of the Second World War, and its effects continue to shape Germany today.
We are speaking about the Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall was a fortified concrete barrier that physically divided the city of Berlin and symbolically divided Germany and Europe, constructed by the German Democratic Republic in 1961 to prevent its citizens from fleeing to the West, and whose collapse in 1989 became the most visible marker of the Cold War's end.
Then let us begin with the origin, with how Germany came to be a country split down the center.
Germany's division was not planned as a permanent condition. It emerged from the immediate practical problems of managing a defeated nation at the end of the Second World War. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The country was occupied by 4 Allied powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Each power controlled a zone of occupation. Berlin, the former capital, lay deep inside the Soviet zone, but Berlin itself was also divided into 4 sectors, one for each occupying power.
So the structure that would become permanent was built as a provisional measure.
Exactly. The wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had been one of military necessity. Once the common enemy was defeated, the underlying ideological and strategic differences reasserted themselves rapidly. The Soviet Union wanted a weak Germany that could never threaten it again, and it wanted governments in Eastern Europe that would align with Soviet interests. The United States and Britain wanted a stable, economically functional Germany that could anchor Western Europe and resist Soviet expansion. By 1947, cooperation between the zones had broken down. The Soviets were dismantling German industry in their zone and shipping it east as reparations. The Western zones were beginning economic reconstruction with American financial support through the Marshall Plan.
Those zones were moving in opposite directions, economically and politically.
Yes, in June 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency in their zones, the Deutschmark, to stabilize the economy. The Soviets responded by blockading West Berlin, cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to the western sectors of the city. The Berlin blockade lasted 11 months. The Western powers supplied the city entirely by air, flying in food, fuel, and medicine in an operation that became known as the Berlin Airlift. At its peak, planes were landing in West Berlin every few minutes around the clock. The blockade failed to force the Western powers out, and it was lifted in May 1949. But the crisis had made clear that the wartime alliance was finished. Germany would not be reunified under a single government.
So by 1949, the temporary division had already hardened into something approaching permanence.
Exactly. In May 1949, the 3 Western zones were formally combined into the Federal Republic of Germany, with its capital in Bonn. In October, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, with its capital in East Berlin. 2 German states now existed, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of Germany. The Federal Republic was a parliamentary democracy aligned with the West. The German Democratic Republic was a socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union. The border between them was initially porous. Germans could still move relatively freely between East and West, particularly through Berlin, where the sector boundaries inside the city were not yet fortified.
So the political division preceded the physical one by more than a decade.
Yes, and during that decade, the economic and social divergence between the 2 Germanys became increasingly stark. West Germany, with American aid and access to Western markets, experienced rapid economic growth. Wages rose, consumer goods became abundant, political freedoms were broadly respected. East Germany, by contrast, remained under strict political control by the Socialist Unity Party, the ruling Communist Party. The economy was centrally planned. Industrial output was redirected to meet Soviet demands, and living standards remained visibly lower than in the West. Germans in the East could see the difference clearly. Radio and television signals crossed the border. Families were split. with relatives on both sides who could still visit. The comparison was immediate and undeniable.
So, the division created a natural experiment in political economy, and the results were visible to everyone involved.
Exactly, and the result was emigration. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 3 million East Germans fled to the west. Most of them left through Berlin, where the sector boundaries were easiest to cross. The emigrants were disproportionately young, educated and skilled, doctors, engineers, teachers. The loss was draining the East German state of the human capital it needed to function. The East German government tried economic incentives, propaganda campaigns, travel restrictions. Nothing stopped the flow. By 1961, the situation had become a political crisis for the socialist bloc.
So the wall was built not as an expression of strength, but as an admission of failure.
Yes. On the night of the 12th of August 1961, East German police and military units began sealing the border. They tore up streets, erected barbed wire fences, and closed the crossing points between East and West Berlin. Berliners woke on the morning of the 13th of August to find their city divided. Families were separated. Workers could not reach their jobs. The underground rail network was severed. Sector boundaries that had been invisible lines on a map were now fortified barriers. Over the following months and years, the barbed wire was replaced with concrete. The initial barrier became a sophisticated system of walls, guard towers, floodlights, anti-vehicle trenches, and a death strip where guards were authorized to shoot anyone attempting to cross.
So the wall evolved from a hasty improvisation into a calculated instrument of control.
Exactly. The East German government called it the anti-fascist protection rampart, claiming it defended the socialist state from Western aggression. But everyone understood its actual function. It kept East Germans from leaving. The wall ran for approximately 155 kilometers around West Berlin. Inside the city itself, it cut through neighborhoods, divided streets, and severed the transport network. It was not a single wall, but a system of barriers, with the most fortified sections facing the west. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 140 people lost their lives attempting to cross the wall. The actual number may be higher. The deaths were not accidental. They were the intended consequence of the shoot to kill orders given to border guards.
So the wall was not merely a physical structure, it was a killing zone.
Yes, and yet life on both sides of it continued. That continuity is one of the more psychologically complex aspects of the division. In West Berlin, the wall became part of the urban landscape. People lived, worked, and raised families in its shadow. The city developed a particular cultural identity, shaped by its isolation deep inside East Germany and its dependence on Western support. West Berlin attracted artists, musicians, and dissidents, drawn by cheap rents, a vibrant counterculture, and exemption from West German military conscription. It was simultaneously a besieged outpost and a bohemian refuge.
So the division created conditions for a particular kind of cultural experimentation.
Exactly. In East Berlin and East Germany more broadly, life was defined by scarcity, surveillance, and restriction. Consumer goods were limited. Travel outside the socialist bloc was nearly impossible for most people. Political dissent was monitored by the Stasi, the state security service, which employed an enormous network of informants. But East Germans also built lives within those constraints. They formed friendships, pursued careers within the permitted range, raised children, found small spaces of autonomy. The system was oppressive, but people are adaptive. The psychological impact of division was profound and often invisible. Families separated by the wall could sometimes arrange visits, but the process required permissions that were arbitrarily granted or denied. Many people went decades without seeing close relatives.
So the wall did not just divide space, it divided time, delaying or preventing experiences that in any unified country would have been ordinary.
Yes, and that temporal dimension is part of what made the division feel permanent to those living through it. A generation of Germans grew up knowing only a divided country. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the wall remained a central symbol of the Cold War. Western leaders visited it to signal their commitment to the divided city. President Ronald Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 and demanded that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev tear down this wall. But it was not Reagan's speech that brought the wall down. It was the gradual unraveling of the political system that had built it.
So the collapse came not from external pressure, but from internal exhaustion.
Exactly. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev was pursuing reforms that reduced Moscow's willingness to support unpopular regimes in Eastern Europe with military force. Poland and Hungary began liberalizing. Thousands took that route during the summer. Inside East Germany, public protests grew. In Leipzig, Monday, demonstrations that had begun small expanded to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The government could no longer rely on Soviet backing to suppress dissent. On the evening of the 9th of November 1989, a senior East German official, Günter Schabowski, held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. When asked when the regulations would take effect, he hesitated, shuffled through his notes and said, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay."
So the collapse began with a bureaucratic misunderstanding.
Yes, Schabowski had not been properly briefed. The regulations were supposed to take effect the following day with controlled procedures, but his statement was broadcast live on television. Thousands of East Berliners converged on the crossing points, demanding to be let through. The border guards had no orders. They were overwhelmed. Shortly before midnight, the guards at the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint opened the gates. People poured through. They climbed onto the wall, danced, embraced strangers, began chipping away at the concrete with hammers and chisels. West Berliners rushed to greet them. The scenes were broadcast globally within hours.
So a structure that had seemed permanent for 28 years became irrelevant in a single night.
Yes. The fall of the wall did not mean immediate reunification, but it made reunification politically inevitable. Within a year, East and West Germany would merge into a single state. The cultural response to the wall's fall was immediate and extraordinary. Music, which had long been a site of cultural resistance in both East and West, became central to the expression of reunification. On New Year's Eve 1989, just weeks after the wall opened, the American actor and musician David Hasselhoff performed at the Berlin Wall in front of hundreds of thousands. He sang a song called "Looking for Freedom," which had become an unexpected anthem in Germany. The performance was widely mocked in the West, but deeply significant to many Germans who were there.
So even a moment that seemed absurd from outside carried real emotional weight for those who had lived through the division.
Exactly, and more substantial musical events followed. In July 1990, Roger Waters, formerly of Pink Floyd, staged a massive production of The Wall at the site of the former border in Berlin. The Wall, originally written in 1979, was a rock opera about isolation, authoritarianism, and the psychological barriers people construct. Performing it in Berlin just months after the literal wall had fallen gave the work an entirely new layer of meaning. The concert featured international artists including Scorpions, Bryan Adams, Cyndi Lauper, and others. It was broadcast to a global audience estimated in the hundreds of millions. The stage set included a wall that was built during the performance and then symbolically torn down.
So the concert was both a celebration and a ritual reenactment, allowing people to participate symbolically in an event that had already happened.
Yes. The German band Scorpions performed their song "Wind of Change," which they had written in response to the political transformations sweeping Eastern Europe. The song became one of the most commercially successful singles in history and remains associated with the end of the Cold War. These cultural moments mattered because they provided a shared language for processing an event that was politically and emotionally overwhelming. The fall of the wall happened so quickly that the symbolic work of understanding it took longer than the event itself.
So culture became the mechanism through which a sudden political rupture could be made legible.
Exactly. Formal reunification occurred on the 3rd of October 1990. Less than a year after the wall fell, the German Democratic Republic ceased to exist. Its territory was absorbed into the Federal Republic under West German law. The process was legally termed reunification, but in practical terms it was closer to an annexation. East Germany adopted West German currency, legal structures, and political institutions. The East German economy collapsed almost immediately, as it was exposed to Western competition without preparation.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Germany was divided and what daily life was like under that division, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with the Berlin Wall, A World Divided by Frederick Taylor.
So this is a book about the structure of division, not just the moment of its collapse.
Precisely. Taylor provides a comprehensive analysis of how Germany became divided after the Second World War, examining the political, economic, and ideological mechanisms that sustained separation for decades. He explores everyday life in East and West Berlin, the international Cold War context that hardened the border, and the gradual erosion of authority that led to the wall's unexpected collapse, separating myth from maya. Documented institutional process.
Is it accessible to someone coming to this history without deep background in Cold War Europe?
It is thorough and detailed, which means it requires attentive reading. But Taylor writes with clarity and builds context as he proceeds. A reader without specialized knowledge will be able to follow the argument. What makes it particularly valuable is that it attends to the human dimension without sentimentalizing. It shows what division actually meant in practical, daily terms.
So reading it gives you not just the political history but the texture of what it felt like to live in a divided city.
Exactly. For anyone who wants to understand why the wall mattered beyond its symbolic weight, Taylor provides the essential foundation.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The economic consequences of reunification were severe and are still being processed today. The exchange rate at which East German marks were converted to West German marks was set politically, rather than economically, at a 1-to-1 ratio for most purposes. This made East German goods and labor immediately uncompetitive. Unemployment in the former East Germany rose dramatically, entire industries collapsed, millions migrated west in search of work. The eastern regions received massive financial transfers from the west, funded by a special solidarity tax that remains in place decades later.
So reunification created new forms of inequality, even as it ended the political division.
Exactly. Many East Germans felt that reunification had meant the loss of their entire social world. The state had been oppressive, but it had also provided employment, childcare, and a certain kind of social stability. All of that disappeared within months. The psychological term nostalgia, a combination of the German words for Eastern nostalgia, emerged to describe a complex longing not for the dictatorship, but for the lost rhythms and certainties of East German life. The Stasi files were open to the public, allowing people to see what had been recorded about them. Many discovered that friends, colleagues, even family members had informed on them. The process of reckoning with that betrayal is still ongoing.
So reunification forced a confrontation with the past that was in some ways more painful than the division itself had been.
Yes, the legacy of division remains visible in German politics, culture, and economic geography. Voting patterns, income levels, and attitudes toward immigration still show significant East-West differences more than 30 years after reunification. The wall itself was almost entirely dismantled. Small sections were preserved as memorials. Fragments were sold as souvenirs. Most of it was ground up and used as construction material for roads. Where the wall once stood, there is now often nothing but a line of brick set into the pavement, marking its former path. Visitors to Berlin today can stand on that line and find it difficult to imagine that it once divided a continent.
So the physical disappearance of the wall has made its former reality harder to grasp.
Exactly. The speed of the wall's fall and its near-total erasure afterward created a strange historical situation. The division lasted 28 years, but it ended so quickly and so completely that it can now seem unreal to those who did not experience it. For historians and political scientists, the fall of the Berlin Wall remains one of the central case studies in how authoritarian systems collapse. The East German state appeared stable until very near the end. It had a formidable security apparatus, economic planning structures, and the backing of a superpower. Yet it unraveled in weeks once the combination of external liberalization in neighboring states, internal protest, and Moscow's withdrawal of support created an opening. The lesson drawn by many observers is that systems that appear permanent can collapse with remarkable speed when the conditions align.
So the wall's fall is studied not just as German history, but as a case study in the fragility of political control.
Yes, the wall's broader historical significance lies in what it represented about the Cold War order. It was the most visible symbol of the division of Europe and the ideological confrontation between two systems. Its fall did not cause the end of the Cold War, but it made that end visible in a way that no diplomatic treaty or policy statement could have. It was an image that millions of people could understand immediately. A barrier coming down, people embracing, a city reuniting. In the 3 decades since, Germany has become the dominant economy in Europe, a leader in the European Union, and a symbol of successful democratic transition. But the process of reunification is still incomplete in important ways.
So the wall is gone, but its effects are not.
Exactly. The history of the Berlin Wall is a reminder that political divisions once established reshape the societies they govern in ways that persist long after the divisions themselves are removed. It is also a reminder that structures built to be permanent can become impossible to maintain, and that when they fall faster than anyone expects. The people who danced on the wall in November 1989 were celebrating not just reunification, but the end of something that had defined their entire lives. For many of them, the world before the wall was only a memory, and the world after it was entirely unknown.
So they were celebrating in the middle of an extraordinary uncertainty.
Yes, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the moment historically significant. The fall of the wall opened possibilities, but it did not determine outcomes. What Germany would become after reunification was genuinely unknown. The wall stood as a monument to the Cold War's logic, that the world was divided into two irreconcilable camps, and that this division was permanent. When it fell, that logic was revealed to have been contingent all along.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the division of a country, the lives lived within that division, and the sudden collapse that made what seemed permanent unimaginable.
The Berlin Wall fell because the system that built it could no longer sustain the fiction that a country could be permanently divided, and its fall reminded the world that no barrier, however fortified, is stronger than the exhaustion of the authority that maintains it.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.